For 3 hours, the baby cried a hoarse, desperate cry, echoing through the cold void of the billionaire's mansion. The snowstorm in Aspen outside was nothing compared to the storm swirling in this nursery. I was her babysitter, her caregiver, exhausted, utterly disoriented. I had tried everything. And then I gave up. I sank to the cold marble floor, holding her small, trembling body against my chest, humming softly, a forgotten song from a life I thought I had left behind. And then silence, a sweet, deep, perfect silence, the silence of a child asleep. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I must have fallen asleep right there on the floor because the next thing I remember is a voice, colder than the glass walls of the house, tearing apart the peaceful moment. "What the hell are you doing here?" Julian Croft, my master, and he looked not at his daughter who had finally found peace, but at me. His eyes burned with an incomprehensible rage. In his eyes, I was just a servant lying on the floor, a blemish in his perfect, orderly world. The contempt was so absolute, I felt my blood turn cold. Let me ask you, when faced with a choice to follow the strict rules of your position or to follow the simple, compassionate call of your heart, which would you choose? That night, in the face of his anger, I was sure my story in this house was over. But I was wrong. Actually, it was just beginning. I am Serafina Jones, and this is the true story of how the coldest heart I have ever met taught me everything I know about love. My story with the Crofts, the one that reshaped my entire world, didn't start with a scream. It started with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical object, pressing in on me from all sides. I remember my first day as if it were etched behind my eyelids. The shuttle from the Eagle County Airport climbed higher and higher into the mountains, the air growing thin and sharp, smelling of pine and impending snow. Then we turned onto a private road, and the house appeared. It wasn't a house, it was a statement. A fortress of glass and blackened steel that seemed to defy the wild, staggering beauty of the Aspen landscape surrounding it. It didn't blend with the mountains, it challenged them. The woman who greeted me at the door was Mrs. Gable. She was a tall, severe woman with her graying hair pulled into a knot so tight it seemed to be the source of the permanent tension in her face. She gave me a single, sweeping glance that took in my worn coat and sensible boots, and I felt instantly appraised and dismissed. "You're Serafina Jones," she stated, not asked. Her voice was as starched as her uniform. "Yes, ma'am, but you can call me Sierra." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed her face before it was smoothed away. "I am Mrs. Gable, the household manager. Follow me." The tour was brief, her words clipped and efficient, echoing in the cavernous, gallery-like space. Polished concrete floors bled into towering walls of glass that framed the snow-dusted peaks outside. The furniture was sparse, architectural, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. It was a museum exhibit on loneliness. "This is the kitchen," she said, gesturing to a vast expanse of stainless steel and white marble. "You will prepare Lyra's formula here precisely as instructed. The schedule is on the refrigerator." She tapped a laminated sheet. "This is the nursery. You will spend most of your time here." She pushed open a door to a room that was, like the rest of the house, beautiful, expensive, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Mr. Croft prefers minimal interaction." She paused, her gaze meeting mine for a fraction of a second, and I thought I saw a warning in her weary eyes. "He values his privacy above all else. Remember that. Minimal interaction, that was the understatement of the century. For the first 2 weeks, Julian Croft was a ghost. I'd hear the whisper-quiet crunch of his expensive shoes on the gravel driveway as his car departed before dawn. I'd catch the faint, lingering scent of his cologne, something clean and woodsy like the forest after a fire in a hallway he'd just passed through. I'd hear the low, controlled murmur of a business call seeping from beneath the heavy door of his study. But I never saw him. He never looked at me, never acknowledged my presence. It was as if I was just another component of the house's smart system, a pre-programmed caregiver unit. I was functional and therefore invisible. My charge, 6-month-old Lyra, was the only source of life in that sterile palace. But she was a sad, flickering life, a tiny candle flame fighting against a blizzard. She cried constantly. It wasn't the robust, demanding cry of a healthy baby. It was a thin, desolate wail that seemed to carry the full weight of the house's silence within it. It would rise and fall, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, a constant soundtrack of sorrow. The pediatrician, a brisk man with cold hands, had diagnosed it as severe colic. Mrs. Gable, in a rare moment of unguarded commentary, had shaken her head and muttered, "It's grief. Babies can feel the absence of a mother like a phantom limb." I tried everything in the nanny's playbook. I rocked her for hours in the designer glider. I sang every lullaby I knew. I gave her warm baths infused with chamomile. I even tried the ridiculously expensive, high-tech bassinet that was supposed to mimic the womb. Nothing worked. The only time she would quiet, truly settle, was when I held her directly against my chest. Her tiny, tense body would slowly relax into mine, her ear pressed against my heart, as if the steady rhythm of it was the only thing that made sense to her in a silent world. Even then, sleep was a fragile truce, a temporary ceasefire in a war I didn't understand. The night it all changed. A snowstorm had descended upon Aspen, a thick, silent blizzard that wrapped the glass house in a cocoon of white, erasing the world outside. The silence only made Lyra's cries seem more piercing. She had been screaming for 3 hours straight, a raw, ragged sound of pure distress. Her face was a blotchy, tear-streaked mess, her tiny body rigid with misery. I was at the breaking point. My arms ached, my back screamed in protest, and my own tears of frustration and exhaustion were threatening to fall. I felt like a complete failure. Finally defeated, I sank to the nursery floor. It was cold, but there was a thick, plush sheepskin rug in the center of the room. I pulled it closer, lay down on my side, and cradled her on my chest, my body a shield against the cold marble beneath. I closed my eyes and started to hum. It was a low, nameless tune my grandmother used to sing to me when I was a child, a melody that smelled like baking bread and felt like safety. And then a miracle. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, her frantic cries subsided. They softened into whimpers, then into soft, hiccuping breaths against my neck. Her little body, once stiff as a board, went limp, melting into me. Her tiny fist, which had been clenched in agony, uncurled and rested over my heart. We both drifted off like that, two shipwrecked souls clinging to the same piece of wreckage in the middle of a vast, cold ocean. I don't know how long we slept, an hour, maybe 2, but I was woken by a sound that cut through the peaceful silence like a shard of ice. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The voice was low, but laced with a venom so potent it made my blood run cold. I scrambled to sit up, my heart leaping into my throat. Julian Croft stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing silhouette against the nursery's dim ambient light. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a storm, his handsome face a thundercloud of absolute fury. He strode into the room, his movements sharp, precise, and filled with anger. "Get up," he commanded, his voice shaking with a barely controlled rage. "Get off my floor and give me my daughter." In his eyes I saw no recognition of the scene before him, a caregiver who had finally managed to comfort his distressed child. He saw a servant who had crossed an invisible, unforgivable line. He saw a smudge on his perfect, minimalist life. He saw dirt on his pristine white rug. Before I could form a single word of explanation, he was there, looming over me. He didn't wait for me to hand her over. He reached down and yanked Lyra from my arms. The movement was rough, jarring. Lyra's fragile piece didn't just break, it shattered into a million pieces. A piercing, terrified shriek tore from her lungs, a sound 100 times more primal and agonizing than all her earlier crying combined. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated fear, and it was aimed directly at her father. I will never forget the look on Julian Croft's face in that moment. It was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The raw, volcanic fury was still there, a dangerous glint in his dark eyes, but it was now at war with a raw, bewildered panic. He held his screaming daughter as if she were a live grenade he had just pulled the pin on. The man who commanded boardrooms with an icy whisper looked utterly, hopelessly lost. "SHH, Lyra, it's me, it's Daddy," he murmured, his voice tight and unnatural. The soft words were a stark contrast to the rigid tension in his body. But his touch, his scent, his very presence seemed to be the source of her terror. It was as if his anger had left a toxic residue in the air that she was breathing in, poisoning her. She writhed in his arms, her tiny hands flailing, batting away his attempts to comfort her. Her face, already blotchy from hours of crying, was turning a frightening shade of dusky purple. It was a primal, absolute rejection, and it struck him like a physical blow. I watched him absorb it. This man who could bend global markets to his will, who could make titans of industry tremble with a single word. He was a man who controlled empires, but he couldn't soothe the frantic terror of his own child. "I don't understand," he growled, his voice a low rumble of frustration aimed at the universe. "Why won't she stop?" In that instant, something shifted inside me. I had managed to scramble to my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct honed from a lifetime of being overlooked, of knowing my place, screamed at me to stay silent. Apologize, disappear, become the furniture again. That was the voice of survival. But then Lyra let out another shriek, a sound so full of pain and fear that it bypassed my brain and went straight to my soul. The voice of survival was drowned out by something fiercer. The part of me that loved that little girl, the part that felt her terror as if it were my own, that part found its voice. "You're scaring her," I said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the tense air of the nursery with the force of a gunshot. His head snapped toward me, his eyes narrowing. I held his gaze, my own fear a cold knot in my stomach, but I didn't back down. "Your anger," I continued, my voice low but firm, refusing to tremble. "She can feel it. It's making it worse. Please, just give her back to me." He glared at me, his jaw tightening until a muscle bunched along his cheek. It was a standoff. The billionaire titan, the master of this cold universe versus the invisible nanny. The air crackled with his wounded pride and my audacious defiance. But the soundtrack to our silent confrontation was his daughter's agonized screams, and it was a sound that was methodically dismantling his composure. For a long, tense minute, he just stood there, his pride wrestling with a desperate, paternal helplessness he had probably never felt before in his life. Finally, with a look of utter, soul-crushing defeat, he moved. He didn't hand her to me. He thrust her at me, an abrupt, angry gesture of surrender. The change was instantaneous, a miracle in motion. The moment Lyra's small, trembling body made contact with mine, her screams choked off. She burrowed her face into the curve of my neck, her little body shaking with violent, residual tremors. Her sobs, which had been screams of terror only seconds before, turned into ragged, exhausted gasps. I sank back down onto the sheepskin rug, the familiar motion of rocking her taking over my body. I started humming that same quiet tune, my own heartbeat a steady rhythm for her to anchor to. Within a minute, her breathing deepened, evening out into the profound peace of sleep. We were back on our raft. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than the snowstorm raging outside. Julian didn't leave. He just stood there, a tall, dark statue in the dim light, watching us. I could feel the weight of his stare on my back, but I didn't dare look up. What was he thinking? Was he going to fire me on the spot? Call security to have me escorted out for my insubordination? I had no idea. After what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, he turned without a single word and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the silence with his sleeping child. I didn't move from that spot for the rest of the night. I was too afraid. I held Lyra tight, listening to the wind howl outside the glass walls, my mind replaying the scene over and over. I had crossed a line. I had challenged him. The invisible nanny had made herself seen, and I was sure there would be consequences. The first gray light of dawn was filtering into the room when Mrs. Gable found me still curled on the rug, my body stiff and cold, with Lyra still asleep on my chest. She took in the scene with her usual unreadable expression, but as she looked at me, her eyes held a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, not pity exactly. It was a weary, knowing sort of understanding, as if she'd seen this storm in him before. She left and returned a few minutes later with a steaming mug of coffee, placing it on the floor beside me. She didn't say a word, she didn't have to. I always took my breakfast alone in the staff kitchen, a sterile room in the basement. As I was forcing down a piece of toast, my stomach churning with anxiety, Mrs. Gable entered. "Mr. Croft wants to see you in his study," she said quietly. At 10 o'clock. My heart plummeted. This was it. The entire morning became a slow, agonizing countdown to my execution. I went back to my small, plain room and stared at my single suitcase, mentally packing my bags, planning my retreat. I saw myself being driven back to the airport in disgrace, the end of a job I so desperately needed. At precisely 10 a.m., I stood before the imposing oak door of his study and knocked, my knuckles feeling small and insignificant against the wood. His voice was flat, disembodied. "Come in." He was standing by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, his back to me, looking out at the vast snow-covered mountains. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his posture rigid. He didn't turn around. "I am doubling your salary," he said, his voice directed at the glass. The words didn't register at first. I was so prepared for dismissal that my brain couldn't process them. I just stood there, mute with shock. And he continued. His voice strained, as if the words were being physically dragged from him. "You will move into the guest suite in the nursery wing. I expect you to be available whenever she needs you, day or night." He finally paused. "Those are my terms." He still hadn't looked at me. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a business transaction, delivered with the same cold precision he probably used to acquire a rival company. He wasn't offering me a promotion for a job well done. He was buying a solution to a problem he couldn't fix. He was buying my constant presence. He was buying my heartbeat. He was buying me. And in that moment, standing in the silence of his opulent office, I was faced with a choice. I could take the money, the life-changing, solve all my problems money, and become a 24/7 human pacifier. Or I could walk away, reclaim my life, and leave that poor, sad little girl to the mercy of her broken father. Looking back, I realize he wasn't just offering me a job. He was offering me a cage, a very beautiful, very comfortable, gilded cage. And I was the one who had to decide whether or not to walk inside and close the door. I said yes. Of course I said yes. The choice in the end wasn't really a choice at all. It was a collision of my own desperation and my deepening affection for that tiny, fragile girl. The thought of leaving Lyra to the mercy of that cold, silent house was a physical pain, a tearing sensation in my chest. And the money, God, the money. It was a lifeline I couldn't refuse. It was the sound of my past debts being silenced. The promise of a future where I wasn't one missed paycheck away from disaster. Mrs. Gable oversaw my move with her usual silent efficiency. There wasn't much to move. A single suitcase of clothes, a handful of paperback books, and a framed photo of my grandmother were transferred from the Spartan staff quarters in the basement to the lavish guest suite on the nursery wing. The door to that suite was heavy, solid wood, and when it clicked shut behind me, the sound echoed with a chilling finality. It was the sound of a lock turning. The room was beautiful, of course, breathtakingly so. The bed was a cloud of white linen and down pillows. The floors were heated marble that felt warm beneath my tired feet. A thick cashmere throw was draped artfully over a chaise lounge that sat before a wall of glass overlooking the entire valley. The ensuite bathroom was larger than my last 2 apartments combined, with a walk-in shower that had more nozzles than I knew what to do with. But it was a cage, a beautiful, silent, velvet-lined cage. My life was no longer my own. It revolved entirely around the whims of a tiny, grieving human and her broken, enigmatic father. My world shrank to the confines of that wing of the house. My schedule was Lyra's schedule. I ate when she slept, quick, solitary meals brought up on a tray by Mrs. Gable. I showered in 5-minute bursts when the housekeeper could spare a moment to sit by the nursery monitor. My only view of the outside world was through that massive window, the mountains a beautiful but distant tableau. I was a prisoner in paradise. Julian, for his part, retreated back into his ghost-like existence, but with a new, unsettling layer. His anger was gone, replaced by an intense, analytical curiosity. He started observing me. I'd be on the floor with Lyra, making a stuffed giraffe dance to elicit one of her rare, precious giggles, and I'd feel a shift in the air. I'd look up and he'd be there, a dark shape standing silently in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression completely unreadable. He never came in, he never spoke, he just watched. The first few times it was unnerving. I felt like a specimen under a microscope, my every move being cataloged and analyzed. He was studying the bond between me and his daughter, trying to deconstruct it, to understand its mechanics as if it were a complex algorithm he could solve and replicate. He wasn't trying to connect, he was trying to comprehend a variable he couldn't control. One afternoon, about a week into my new gilded imprisonment, a summons came via the intercom. His voice was clipped, all business. My study now. When I entered, he was already engrossed in his work. His desk was a vast expanse of polished ebony, dominated by an array of glowing screens displaying stock tickers, lines of code, and complex architectural renderings. He didn't look up from his monitor when I walked in. "I need to go to San Francisco for 3 days," he said, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "It's a critical funding round for the new clean energy venture. You and Lyra will come with me." Again, it wasn't a request, it was a logistical command. "Mrs. Gable will handle the arrangements," he added, still not looking at me. "Be ready to leave tomorrow morning at 6. The trip was a surreal blur of dizzying opulence. We flew on a private jet that felt more like a luxury apartment in the sky, all cream leather and polished chrome. Lyra surprisingly was calm for the entire flight, her wide eyes fascinated by the endless expanse of clouds outside her window. In San Francisco, a black car whisked us away to a penthouse suite at the Four Seasons that seemed to float above the city, with a panoramic view of the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. It was all so grand, so far removed from my reality, that it felt like a dream I was having. But the cage had simply become smaller, more portable with a much better view. That night, Lyra was fussy, unsettled by the new environment, her routine disrupted. After trying everything else, I found myself in a familiar position, on the floor on a plush cream-colored hotel rug, humming her to sleep on my chest. The door to my adjoining room was slightly ajar, and I could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of Julian's keyboard in the living room. He was working, as always. Later, after I'd gently placed a deeply sleeping Lyra into her travel crib, I stepped out onto the suite's private balcony. The cool, damp air felt wonderful on my face. The city lights glittered below, a silent, sprawling universe of a million other lives. I hugged my thin cardigan tighter around myself, feeling small and anonymous. A moment later, sliding door whispered open and Julian joined me. He was holding 2 tall glasses of what looked like champagne. "It's just sparkling water," he said, his voice quiet as if preempting a refusal. He handed one to me. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and a strange jolt like static electricity passed between us. We stood in silence for a few moments, the city's hum a distant soundtrack. "Why her?" he asked suddenly, his voice so low I almost didn't hear it over the wind. He wasn't looking at me, he was staring out at the bridge. "Why does she only respond to you?" I took a slow sip of water, my hand trembling slightly. I chose my words carefully. "I don't think it's about me, Mr. Croft," I said. "I think she just needs to feel safe. She needs consistency, a heartbeat that's always there, steady when everything else is quiet. He stared out at the city, his jaw tight. Her mother, Genevieve, it was the first time he had ever said her name to me. His voice was raw, stripped of all its usual corporate armor. Her heartbeat was the first thing Lyra ever heard. He took a sharp breath, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the cold metal railing. She died during childbirth. An embolism. 1 minute she was here, the next. He trailed off, the words lost to the night air. The doctors said Lyra was fine physically, but I think she was born with a broken heart. He finally turned his head, and in the soft glow of the city lights I saw the profound, bottomless grief in his eyes. And I have no idea how to fix it. In that moment, looking at his tormented profile, I saw past the billionaire, past the tyrant, past the cold, commanding ghost. I saw a man drowning, utterly and completely lost in a sea of his own making. And a dangerous, foolish, compassionate thought crossed my mind, a thought that would change everything. Maybe I can help him. That moment of vulnerability on the balcony, suspended high above the glittering city, changed something between us. It was a tiny hairline crack in the formidable armor he wore so tightly. The air in the penthouse suite the next morning was different. It was still quiet, but the silence was no longer empty. It was watchful, expectant. He found me in the small kitchenette area, feeding Lyra her morning oatmeal. He was already dressed in another impeccable suit, the corporate mask firmly back in place, but I could see the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He cleared his throat, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I have a dinner meeting tonight," he said, his tone clipped and formal. He was focused on stirring his black coffee, avoiding my gaze. "It's with Elias Vance. He's a potential key investor for my new clean energy venture, an important meeting." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "The dinner is our private club, and bringing a baby is unconventional, but canceling is not an option." He finally looked at me, and his eyes held a flicker of that same desperation I'd seen on the balcony. "I need you there to manage her." A cold wave of panic washed over me, at a private, high-powered business dinner, trying to keep a baby, whose moods were as unpredictable as the weather, quiet and content while millions of dollars were being negotiated. It was my worst nightmare. "Mr. Croft, I don't think that's appropriate," I stammered, my cheeks flushing with heat. "I'm not dressed for that kind of place, and Lyra would be much more comfortable here in her own space." "The club has a private lounge we can use if she becomes fussy," he countered, dismissing my concerns with a wave of his hand. He was already turning away, the conversation apparently over in his mind. "But sir," he stopped and turned back, his patience wearing thin. A flash of the old, dismissive Julian returned. "I'll double your bonus for the month," he said, resorting to his usual tactic of throwing money at a problem. But this time I saw through it. It wasn't about the money, not really. It wasn't a power play. It was a plea. He was admitting, in the only way he knew how, that he couldn't do this alone. He didn't know how to be a father and a CEO at the same time, and the thought of facing this critical meeting with the added variable of potentially crying baby was more than he could handle. I saw the drowning man from the balcony again. "Okay," I said quietly. "I'll be ready." The private club was exactly as intimidating as I had imagined. It was a bastion of old-world San Francisco, all dark, polished wood, supple leather chairs, and the hushed, conspiratorial whispers of deals being made. The air smelled of expensive scotch and old money. The maitre d' looked down his nose at Lyra's carrier with barely concealed disdain. I felt like a field mouse that had accidentally wandered into a lion's den. Elias Vance was the opposite of Julian. Where Julian was a storm, contained and severe, Elias was a slick, unctuous oil slick. He was handsome in a polished, predictable way, with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Julian, my friend," he boomed, clapping Julian on the shoulder. "And this must be the lovely Lyra." He made a big show of cooing over the baby, but his gaze kept flicking to me, a dismissive, appraising look that made my skin crawl. He saw my simple black dress, the only appropriate thing I owned, and the way I held Lyra, and categorized me in a single, condescending glance. The nanny, the help. The dinner was an excruciating exercise in tension. I sat at a small, discreet table just behind theirs, a ghost at the feast, trying to keep Lyra entertained with soft toys and quiet games. For the most part, she was a little angel, mesmerized by the clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation. But halfway through the main course, her good mood began to curdle. She started to fuss, her little face scrunching up in prelude to a wail. My heart pounded. "Excuse me," I murmured, quickly scooping her up and making a swift exit toward a small, empty lounge area I had scouted earlier. The room was blessedly quiet. I walked her around, rocking her gently, trying to soothe her before she escalated. A few minutes later, a shadow fell across the doorway. "Having trouble?" Elias Vance asked, that oily smile plastered on his face. He leaned against the doorframe, a picture of relaxed confidence. She's just a little overtired, I said, keeping my voice neutral, my back mostly to him. Of course, he said, stepping into the room. Mr. Croft is a brilliant man, a genius even, but he's always been intense. He paused, letting the word hang in the air. Losing his wife like that, it's a tragedy. He's lucky to have someone like you to handle the domestic side of things. The condescension in his voice was so thick I could have choked on it. He took another step closer, his cologne cloying and sweet. You know, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, a woman with your skills could do very well for herself, if you play your cards right. He was looking at me now in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with my caregiving abilities. It was predatory, speculative. It was disgusting. Before I could form a response, before I could tell him exactly where he could shove his unsolicited advice, another voice cut through the air, a voice like cold steel. Vance. Julian was standing right behind him, his face a mask of controlled fury. He had moved so silently, neither of us had heard him approach. Elias turned, his charming smile faltering for just a second. Julian, just making conversation, he said, recovering quickly. Admiring your setup. His eyes flicked to me again, a clear insinuation in the word. Julian took a deliberate step forward, his presence suddenly immense, dangerous. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The discussion at the table was about geothermal energy. Julian said, his voice dangerously low and even. Not my household staff. He paused. My daughter was fussy. Her nanny was attending to her. That is the beginning and the end of this conversation. He held Elias's gaze, and the threat, though unspoken, was unmistakable. Are we clear? Elias Vance's practiced charm finally evaporated, replaced by a flash of raw resentment in his eyes. He gave a curt, jerky nod. Crystal. He turned and retreated back to the dining room without another word. Julian then turned to me. The fury was still simmering in his eyes, but it was directed at Elias, not me. His gaze softened almost imperceptibly as it landed on me. Are you all right? He asked, his voice still low, but the menace was gone. I was so stunned, all I could do was nod, my throat too tight to speak. He looked down at Lyra, who, startled by the tension, had settled in my arms and was now watching him with wide, curious eyes. Then he looked back at me. He didn't say thank you. He didn't apologize for putting me in that position. He didn't have to. In that moment, he had defended me. He had drawn a line in the sand. He had seen me not as furniture, not as a function, but as a person under his protection. The crack in his armor had just gotten a little bit wider. The flight back to Aspen was different. The silence inside the rarefied air of the private jet was no longer heavy with unspoken tension or the threat of dismissal. It was filled with a new, fragile awareness. We sat across from each other, Lyra sleeping peacefully in her carrier between us, and for the first time he didn't hide behind a laptop screen or a stack of financial reports. He just watched the clouds. After a while, he cleared his throat. The chamomile tea you use in her bath, he started, his voice a little rough, as if he were unaccustomed to forming such a domestic question. What brand is it? I was so taken aback it took me a moment to answer. It's nothing special, Mr. Croft, just an organic brand from the market in town. It's supposed to be calming. I see, he said, nodding slowly, filing the information away as if it were a key piece of market data. A few minutes later, another question. And the music you hum to her, is it a real song? No, sir, I said, a small, shy smile touching my lips. Just something my grandmother used to hum. He nodded again, a thoughtful, distant look on his face. He was trying to learn the language of his own daughter's life, a language that, until now, only I had spoken. He was trying to map out her world of comfort, a world he had been a complete stranger to. Back at the mansion, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The oppressive silence was still there, but it felt less cold. The invisible walls between us, once solid and impenetrable, had become porous. He started spending less time locked away in the fortress of his study. He'd appear in the nursery not just to observe from the doorway, but to actually come inside. The first time it happened, my heart nearly stopped. I was on the floor with Lyra, stacking soft, colorful blocks, and he just walked in and sat down on the far side of the rug. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, looking profoundly out of place in his expensive, tailored slacks, watching us. He looked like an anthropologist cautiously observing an unfamiliar tribe. He was a student, tentatively, cautiously learning the rhythms of his own home. One afternoon, a moment of pure magic happened. Lyra, who had been content to sit and watch the world, suddenly got a look of fierce determination on her face. She flattened herself onto her belly, her little legs kicking, and began to wriggle her way across the rug. It wasn't graceful, but it was purposeful. And she wasn't heading for the brightly colored block tower I'd built, or for her favorite stuffed giraffe. She was heading straight for her father. She collapsed in a happy, exhausted heap right at his feet, looking up at him with a gummy, triumphant smile that lit up her entire face. I held my breath watching him. Julian looked down at his daughter as if he were seeing a miracle. His face was a breathtaking mixture of shock and profound wonder. He slowly, hesitantly, reached out a hand and stroked her soft, downy hair. A real smile, not a smirk, not a polite upturn of the lips, but a genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. It transformed his entire face, erasing the years of grief and tension. It was like watching the sun break through the clouds after a long, bitter winter. But as the ice between me and Julian began to thaw, I started to notice other things. The house had secrets. The warmth I was starting to feel in the nursery didn't extend to the rest of the mansion. I would walk into the kitchen to grab a bottle for Lyra, and would overhear snippets of hushed, hurried conversations between Mrs. Gable and the grocery delivery man. I'd see her speaking softly into the phone, her back to the room, only to hang up abruptly the second I entered. There were whispers, fragments I couldn't quite piece together. Phrases like Genevieve's sister, the terms of the estate, and the one that chilled me the most, what Julian doesn't know. Mrs. Gable remained a fortress of professionalism around me, but I could feel her watching me with a new kind of scrutiny. It wasn't hostile, it was wary, as if she knew I was getting closer to the heart of the family and she was worried about what I might find there. The mystery deepened and took on a face one crisp Tuesday morning. The doorbell chimed, a rare occurrence, and a moment later, a woman I'd never seen before breezed into the main hall. She didn't wait for Mrs. Gable to announce her. She moved with an air of absolute ownership. She was stunningly, intimidatingly beautiful, with the same raven dark hair and piercing blue eyes as Julian. She was dressed in a chic cashmere coat and leather boots that probably cost more than my entire year's salary before I came here. "Julian, darling," she called out, her voice a melodic purr that echoed in the cavernous hall. Julian emerged from his study, and the warmth I'd seen on his face just yesterday vanished instantly. His expression hardened into a familiar cold mask. "Genevieve," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any welcome. "What are you doing here? Is that any way to greet your sister?" She purred, gliding towards him and kissing the air beside his rigid cheek. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, landed on me where I stood holding Lyra. They swept over my simple sweater and jeans in a quick, dismissive glance. "And who is this?" "This is Serafina Jones," Julian said, his tone clipped, leaving no room for argument. "Lyra's nanny." Genevieve's smile was as sharp and bright as broken glass. "Of course, the help." She turned her full attention to Lyra, her expression softening into something that looked like doting affection but felt practiced, rehearsed. "Oh, look at her. She has her mother's eyes, doesn't she?" She reached out a perfectly manicured hand to touch Lyra's cheek. And Lyra, my brave, intuitive Lyra, recoiled. She twisted in my arms, burying her face in my shoulder and letting out a distinct, unhappy whimper. Genevieve's smile tightened at the edges, a flicker of annoyance in her perfect blue eyes. "Shy is she?" she asked, her voice still sweet but with an underlying edge of steel. She looked directly at Julian. "Or is she just not used to family?" The barb was aimed squarely at him, but it felt like it hit me too. Her visit was short, tense, and left a strange, lingering chill in the air long after the sound of her sports car had faded down the mountain. She was a piece of the puzzle I didn't understand. A whisper from the past that hinted at deeper, darker secrets hidden within the beautiful, fragile walls of that glass house. A week after his sister's unsettling visit, the fragile peace we had found was shattered again. Julian found me in the nursery, a drawn, weary look on his face that spoke of sleepless nights and internal battles. "I have to go back to San Francisco," he announced, his voice strained. He paced in front of the window, unable to stand still. It's about Genevieve's estate, legal matters, it's a mess." He stopped and turned to me, and the look in his eyes was raw, stripped of all pretense. "I'd like you to come with Lyra." He took a breath, and the admission that came next felt like it cost him everything. "And not just for her. I don't want to face it alone." The words hung in the air between us, a testament to the chasm we had crossed since that first night. He wasn't commanding me anymore. He was asking. He was admitting he needed me, and in that moment I knew there was no other possible answer. "Of course, Mr. Croft," I said softly. "We'll be ready." San Francisco felt different this time. The city wasn't just a backdrop for a tense business deal. It was the heart of the mystery surrounding his late wife, a place heavy with her ghost. Julian was consumed by meetings in sleek, modern law offices downtown, leaving me and Lyra with long stretches of time to ourselves. I took her to Golden Gate Park, laying a blanket on the grass and watching her kick her little feet at the sky. I pushed her in a stroller along the waterfront, the salty air whipping through my hair, the cry of the gulls a joyful sound. For the first time, it felt less like I was a caged employee and more like a person. A person on a very strange, very luxurious trip, but a person nonetheless. For a few hours at a time, I could almost pretend we were a normal family. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was Julian. His voice was tight with a familiar, controlled frustration. Sierra, I'm stuck, he said, the sound of muffled voices in the background. This meeting is dragging on, the lawyers are being difficult. I'm not going to be able to get away. He paused, and I could hear him take a sharp breath. I need you to do something for me, something important. Of course, I said immediately. What is it? I need you to go to my late wife's apartment, he said, the words sounding stiff, unnatural. There's a box of personal documents in the desk in her study. Old tax records, things like that. The lawyers need them for the estate proceedings. It's urgent. He gave me the address in Pacific Heights. I'll have a courier send the key to the hotel. Can you do that for me? Yes, Mr. Croft, I'm on my way. The apartment building was a beautiful, historic brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street, a world away from the cold steel of Aspen. The air in the lobby smelled of lemon polish and old books. When I used the key to open the door to Genevieve's apartment, I felt a jolt. It was nothing like the house Julian lived in now. This place was warm, vibrant, and intensely personal. The walls were painted a deep teal, covered in eclectic art. Bookshelves overflowed with novels and poetry. A half-finished painting stood on an easel by the window, catching the afternoon light. It felt like a place where someone had actually lived, and laughed and loved. It felt like her. Holding a sleeping Lyra in one arm, I moved through the space, feeling like a complete intruder, a ghost in someone else's life. I found the study and the antique writing desk he'd described. The bottom drawer held a heavy banker's box, just as he'd said. As I carefully lifted it with my free hand, something behind it shifted and slid into view with a soft clatter. It was another, smaller box, this one made of black lacquer, inlaid with mother of pearl. It wasn't a document box, it was a memory box, it wasn't locked. My heart started to pound. Don't open it, Sierra, it's not your business, it's a violation of the highest order. That was the voice of the professional, the employee. But another voice, a louder, more human one, whispered, this is the key to understanding everything. My hands trembling, I set the banker's box on the floor and gently lifted the lid of the lacquered box. Inside was not what I expected. There were no sentimental keepsakes, no dried flowers or baby booties. There was a stack of letters tied with a silk ribbon, a single unfamiliar key, and a thick stack of photographs. My breath caught in my throat. The photos were of Genevieve, his beautiful deceased wife. But she wasn't alone. In every single one she was with Elias Vance. And they weren't business photos, they were intimate. The two of them laughing on a sailboat, his arm draped possessively around her shoulders. The two of them sharing a bottle of wine at a sidewalk cafe in what looked like a European alleyway, their heads bent close together. One photo, a candid, stolen shot, was of him kissing her, a deep, passionate kiss that was miles away from a friendly greeting. My blood went cold. I picked up the letters, my fingers numb. The handwriting was Elias's, the contents passionate, secret, and damning. They spoke of stolen weekends, of a love that was being stifled, of a future they were planning together. They were all dated within the last year of her life. The final one, postmarked just 3 weeks before Lyra was born, was chilling. Leave him, Jen. Come with me. He doesn't deserve you. He never has. He's a cage and you're meant to fly. We can have the life we always talked about. The funds are in place. The Paris apartment is waiting. Just say the word. My hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. This wasn't just an affair. This was a whole secret life. A planned escape. Julian thought his wife had died loving him, but she had been actively planning to leave him for the very man he was now considering as a major business partner. The man who had looked at me with such predatory contempt. Then my eyes fell on the key. It was heavy, ornate. A safe deposit box key. A wave of nausea washed over me so strong I had to sit down. What was I supposed to do? This information was a bomb. A nuclear bomb capable of destroying Julian, of shattering the fragile peace he was just beginning to find with his daughter. If I told him, I would be the one lighting the fuse. I would be the bringer of a pain so profound I couldn't even imagine it. But if I didn't, if I said nothing, I would be complicit in a lie that felt monstrous. I would be watching him walk into a deal with a viper, knowing the viper had already struck his heart once before. I carefully, reverently placed the letters and photos back in the lacquered box. I slid it back into its hiding place in the drawer, behind the heavy box of tax records. I stood up, took the documents he'd asked for, and walked out of the apartment, the weight of the secret pressing down on me, heavier than any box. The deception wasn't just in San Francisco anymore. I was now carrying it back to Aspen with me. Returning to Aspen was like returning to a different planet, one that looked identical to the one I'd left but operated under a different set of physical laws. The clean, cold mountain air that had once felt so invigorating now felt thin and suffocating. The profound silence of the house was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, pregnant with the ghosts of what I now knew. The secret I carried was a living thing, a constant, heavy presence at my side. Every time I looked at Julian, a tidal wave of guilt and pity washed over me. He was so cautiously, so painfully trying to rebuild his life from the rubble of his grief. And I was holding the sledgehammer that could bring his entire world crashing down. He was more open now, more present. He would ask me small, tentative questions about my day. He'd ask for my opinion on things related to Lyra, a new brand of organic baby food, the temperature of the nursery. He was trying to bridge the chasm between his world and hers, and he was using me as the architect. The most painful moments were the moments of progress. One evening, Lyra, sitting in her high chair, discovered the joy of flinging food. A spoonful of bright green mashed peas went airborne and landed with a perfect splat right on the lapel of his immaculate charcoal gray sweater. I froze, expecting the old Julian to surface, a flash of annoyance at the mess. Instead, he looked down at the green smudge, then at his daughter's delighted, gummy grin, and a sound I'd never heard from him before rumbled in his chest. A real, deep, genuine laugh. It was a beautiful, startling sound, and it felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I had to force a smile, my heart aching with the weight of the truth I was withholding. I was a terrible actress. The secret was a poison, and it was changing me. I became withdrawn. Jumpy, a closing door would make me start. I couldn't meet his eyes for more than a second. I spent more time than necessary in my room pleading exhaustion. He noticed, of course. He was becoming far too observant. "Sierra, is everything all right?" he asked one evening. He'd found me in the nursery long after Lyra was asleep, just standing by the window, staring out at the star-dusted mountains. His voice was quiet, laced with a genuine concern that made me feel even more like a fraud. "I'm fine, Mr. Croft," I mumbled, turning away from the window. "Just tired, it's been a long week." The excuse felt flimsy and pathetic even to me. He looked at me for a long moment, his brow furrowed. I could see him debating whether to press the issue. The old Julian would have dismissed me. This new Julian simply gave a slow nod. "Get some rest then," he said softly. "You deserve it." His kindness was 1,000 times harder to bear than his anger ever had been. My inner turmoil was a constant storm. The debate raged in my head day and night. Should I tell him? What right do I have to detonate another person's life to inflict that kind of pain? But then the other voice would answer, just as loud. What right do you have to let him walk into a business partnership with the man who was his wife's secret lover? A predator who was taunting you, a man who, for all you knew, could have had something to do with the mess of her estate. The safe deposit box key was in the pocket of my jeans. I'd find myself touching it, the cold, heavy metal a constant, damning reminder of the choice I was refusing to make. What was in there? More letters, legal documents, something worse? The decision in the end was taken out of my hands. Elias Vance came to Aspen. He arrived on a Friday afternoon unannounced, the purr of his silver Porsche jarring intrusion into the mountain quiet. He strode into the house carrying a ridiculously expensive bottle of wine, his smile as wide and false as ever. "Julian," he boomed, finding us in the main living area. "Thought I'd surprise you. I was in Vail for a conference. Figured I'd pop over to finalize the details of our geothermal deal in person. We need to celebrate our impending partnership." His presence in the house felt like a violation. He oozed a smug, proprietary confidence that made my skin crawl. He treated me with a cloying, false politeness that was somehow more insulting than overt rudeness. "And Serafina, the miracle worker," he said, giving me a conspiratorial wink. "Keeping this place running, I see you're a saint." His eyes held a glint of pure mockery. He was playing a game and I was an unwilling pawn. That night, Julian, in an attempt to be a gracious host, cooked dinner. The result was a slightly charred steak and a salad that was mostly lettuce, but Elias praised it as if it were a Michelin-starred meal. The conversation was all business, full of terms and figures I didn't understand. I sat there, picking at my food, feeling the tension coiling in my stomach. Then Elias leaned back, swirling his wine. "You know, this mountain air, it reminds me of a trip I took to Monaco a few years back, incredibly restorative. I was staying at the Hotel de Paris, had this incredible dinner at Le Louis Roman 15, you know, the one, Ducass's place." My fork froze halfway to my mouth, the blood drained from my face and a roaring sound filled my ears. Hotel de Paris. Le Louis Roman 15. The names were seared into my brain, lifted directly from the pages of the letters I'd read. He was talking about a trip he had taken with Genevieve. He was passing it off right in front of her husband as a solo business venture. I looked up, my eyes wide with shock, and I met his across the table. He knew. A tiny, almost imperceptible smirk touched the corner of his mouth. It was a look of pure, triumphant malice. He knew I had been in the apartment. He suspected I had found something. And he was taunting me, daring me. He was showing me how untouchable he was, how easily he could manipulate the man sitting right next to him. I couldn't breathe. The air in the room was gone. "Excuse me," I choked out, standing so abruptly that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I fled the room, my heart pounding in my ears, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the doorknob to the nursery. I collapsed against the wall in the dark, quiet room, gasping for air. He was a monster, and I was letting him get away with it. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't be a silent accomplice to this grotesque lie. I had to tell Julian. I had to give him the weapon he needed to fight back. I didn't know how, but I knew it had to be now. I waited, my entire body trembling, until I heard the front door close and the sound of Elias's Porsche fading into the night. I took a deep, shaky breath, walked out of the nursery, and went to the study. The door was ajar. Julian was inside, standing with his back to me, staring into the crackling flames of the fireplace. The safe deposit box key felt like a block of ice in my hand. I pushed the door open. It creaked softly. He turned. "Julian," I began, my voice a trembling whisper that barely carried across the room. "There's something you need to know." I walked forward, my legs unsteady, and placed the cold, heavy key on the polished ebony of his desk. It made a small, definitive click in the quiet room. "It's about your wife and about Elias Vance." The storm inside me was finally about to break, and I knew with a terrible, sickening certainty that it was going to wreck everything. I laid the key on his desk. The small, ornate piece of metal made a soft, definitive click on the polished ebony, a sound that seemed to sever the fragile peace that had been growing between us. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was a solid, physical thing pressing down on us, charged with the weight of everything unsaid. The fire crackled in the hearth, oblivious. Julian didn't look at the key at first. He looked at me. His eyes, the same eyes that had recently started to show warmth, trust, even hints of a smile, were now shuttered, guarded. The walls went up so fast I felt the chill from across the room. "What is this, Sierra?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet, each word precise and edged with steel. My own voice, when I found it, was barely a whisper. My throat felt tight, dry. "I found it," I said, my gaze dropping to the key. "In her apartment, in a hidden box. There were letters and photographs." I took a shaky breath and forced myself to say the name that would change everything. Of her and Elias. I didn't need to say more. The single word Elias was enough. It was a catalyst. I watched as the color drained from his face, leaving his handsome features looking stark and hollow in the firelight. The carefully constructed composure he had been building for months didn't just crack, it crumbled into dust. But he didn't rage. He didn't yell or throw things or demand answers. He did something far more terrifying. He went perfectly, unnaturally still. It was the stillness of a man bracing for a catastrophic impact, a man whose entire world was imploding from the inside out. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, picked up the key, and his long fingers closed around it, his knuckles turning white. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "Where?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a man already in shock. The next morning was a blur of thick, suffocating tension. The house was silent, but it was the silence of a tomb. Julian moved through it like a phantom, his face a granite mask. He didn't speak to me. He didn't speak to Mrs. Gable, who took one look at his face and then moved about her duties with a quiet, fearful efficiency. He made a single phone call from his study, his voice too low and clipped for me to overhear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of a general giving a final, grim command. A little while later, he found me in the kitchen, nervously wiping down a counter that was already spotless. "Get in the car," he said. It wasn't a request, it was a flat, dead command. I didn't ask where we were going. I just took off my apron and followed him. We drove into Aspen in a silence so thick I felt like I could barely breathe. The sun was bright, the snow on the peaks glittered, the world outside the car was alive with beauty. Inside the car, it was a black hole of grief and impending doom. I sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, acutely aware of his rigid posture, the tight, bloodless grip of his hands on the steering wheel. I felt like an accomplice, a reluctant witness being taken to the scene of a crime. He pulled up in front of a small, discreet building of stone and dark wood that had no sign, only a small brass number on the door. A private bank. He shut off the engine and got out without a word. For a moment I stayed put, my hand on the door handle. This was his pain, his private hell. What right did I have to be there? But as he walked toward the door, I knew I had to follow. I had set this in motion. I couldn't abandon him now. A nervous, sweating man in an ill-fitting suit, a Mr. Peterson, greeted us in the lobby, his eyes darting everywhere but at Julian's face. He led us through a series of hushed, carpeted corridors to a massive, circular vault door. The sound of the tumblers turning echoed in the silence. Mr. Peterson used Julian's key, then his own, to open a long, slender metal box. "The viewing room is ready for you, Mr. Croft," he whispered. Julian took the box. It didn't look heavy, but he held it like it contained the weight of the world. He walked into a small, sterile, windowless room. There was nothing inside but a polished mahogany table and 2 chairs. He placed the box on the table between us, looked at me for a single, unreadable moment, and then he opened the lid. The contents were worse than I could have imagined. My mind had conjured more love letters, maybe some sentimental trinkets. The reality was a cold, calculated, full-blown shadow life. He laid them out on the table one by one. There were property deeds for a condominium on the Isle Saint Louis in Paris. A place I knew from magazines was one of the most exclusive addresses in the world, registered under a shell corporation I recognized from my time in his study. There were bank statements for an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, detailing a series of systematic transfers, the final balance a number with so many zeros it made me feel dizzy. And then, at the bottom, there was a document in a sealed envelope. A second will. A will signed and notarized by Genevieve Croft just 1 week before Lyra was born. With a steady hand, Julian tore it open. It was short, legalistic, and brutal. It left a significant portion of her personal fortune, a fortune I now realized had been stolen from him, not to her husband and not to her unborn daughter, but to something called the Vancecroft Trust for Future Ventures. The sole executor and beneficiary was Elias Vance. It was a betrayal on an epic, almost unimaginable scale. She hadn't just been planning to leave him. She had been systematically siphoning funds, building a new life with his primary business rival, and in her final act had callously, cruelly cut her own child out of her inheritance. Julian read through every single document with that same terrifying stillness. He didn't curse. He didn't break down. He just absorbed it, each page another invisible blow, his face growing paler, more chiseled until he looked like a statue carved from ice. When he was done, he carefully stacked the papers back into a neat pile. He looked up at me and his eyes were hollow, empty, as if the life behind them had been extinguished. "She never loved me," he said. The words were a statement of fact, not a question. A quiet, dead, final verdict on his own life. It was all a transaction, just like everything else. And in that moment he looked at me, the woman he had once accused of being a servant sleeping on his floor, the woman he had tried to buy with a doubled salary, and I think for the very first time he finally understood the difference. I had stayed for Lyra. I had stayed for a heartbeat. His wife had stayed for the money. The reckoning wasn't just about her betrayal. It was about his own profound blindness, about the cold, transactional world he had built to protect himself, a world that had left him vulnerable to the most devastating deception of all. He stood up, gathered the documents that represented the ruin of his past, and tucked them into his coat pocket. He walked out of the sterile viewing room without a backward glance, leaving me alone with the empty metal box. He was a man who had just lost a ghost, and the grief that was about to hit him, I knew, would be 1,000 times more real, and 1,000 times more painful than the one he'd been carrying before. The drive back to the mansion was a silent testament to the devastation. The Julian Croft who had entered that bank was gone for good. In his place was someone I hadn't seen before, not the grieving, withdrawn husband, not the volatile, angry tyrant, but a man of cold, calculating, and absolute fury. The mask was back, but this time it wasn't hiding grief, it was channeling rage into a laser-focused weapon. When we walked through the grand entrance of the house, he didn't look at me, didn't look at Mrs. Gable, who stood waiting with a worried expression. He walked with a chillingly calm stride directly to his study and closed the door. The soft, definitive click of the lock echoed through the silent hall. It was a declaration of war. For the next 48 hours the house transformed. The quiet, sterile atmosphere of the mansion was replaced by the tense, humming energy of a corporate war room. Sleek black cars arrived at all hours, depositing men in sharp, dark suits who spoke in hushed, urgent tones. They were Julian's lawyers, his top executives, the most ruthless minds in his arsenal. They moved through the house with grim purpose, their briefcases full of ammunition. The low murmur of international conference calls became a constant, sleepless hum. Food was delivered on silver trays and went largely untouched. Coffee was brewed by the gallon. Julian was dismantling his life and his business, piece by painful, methodical piece, searching for every trace of the rot that had been festering beneath the surface. Through all of this, I focused on Lyra. I kept her world small and safe, contained within the nursery wing, a bubble of lullabies and soft toys, shielded from the storm raging in the rest of the house. I was surprised that he didn't shut me out completely. In fact, he did the opposite. It was late on the second night, well past 2 in the morning. I was in my room, unable to sleep when the intercom beside my bed crackled to life. It was his voice, rough with exhaustion. "Sierra, my study, please." My heart pounded as I made my way there. The room was barely recognizable. It was littered with documents, financial charts, empty coffee cups, and scrawled-on legal pads. He was standing in the middle of it all, his tie loosened, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking like a general on the verge of collapse after days of relentless battle. He gestured vaguely at the chaos around him. "I need your help," he said, his voice raw. "Not with Lyra, with this." I stared at him confused. "Mr. Croft, I don't understand, I don't know anything about." "No," he interrupted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. He finally looked at me and his eyes were haunted. You see people, Sierra, you see what's real. I see numbers and contracts and bottom lines. I thought I was invincible because I was smarter than everyone in the room. He gave a short, bitter laugh. I was blind. Blinded by my own arrogance. I need your eyes. It was an insane request. He wanted me, the nanny, to be his advisor in a multi-million-dollar corporate war. He wanted me to sit in on the calls, to look at the photos of the people involved, to read the predeposition statements from his staff, and to give him my gut feeling. He wanted me to be his human lie detector. It was madness. But I looked at his face, at the raw desperation behind the wall of anger, and I saw the man from the bank vault, the man whose entire world had been revealed as a lie. "Okay, Julian," I said, using his first name for the very first time. "Okay." And so began my crash course in the brutal art of corporate warfare. I sat on a leather chair in the corner of his study, a silent observer in a world I had no right to be in. I listened as Julian and his legal team methodically, ruthlessly, built their case against Elias Vance. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. That was a personal wound. This was about something he could fight. This was about fraud, embezzlement, a years-long conspiracy to defraud his company. The Paris condo, the offshore accounts, his team quickly traced the money trail. The funds had been expertly funneled through a series of shell companies linked to Grayson Global's renewable energy subsidiaries, projects that Elias had personally overseen for years. Genevieve hadn't just been his lover, she had been his willing and very knowledgeable accomplice. My role was strange, but as Julian had predicted, crucial. During one late-night conference call with a vice president named Reynolds, a man the lawyers thought was clean, Julian put the call on mute and turned to me. "What do you hear, Sierra?" I closed my eyes, focusing only on the man's voice. "He sounds rehearsed," I said slowly. "Like he's reading a script someone else wrote for him. He's afraid of saying the wrong word." Julian's eyes narrowed. He unmuted the call. "David," he said to his lead attorney, "I want you to pull every email, every text message, every calendar invite Reynolds has sent to or received from Elias Vance in the last 3 years. Everything." The lawyers on the call were baffled, but they did as they were told. An hour later, they found it. A thinly veiled set of instructions from Elias to Reynolds on how to answer questions if anyone ever started digging into the Monaco project's finances. My intuition, honed by a lifetime of having to read people just to survive, had become a valuable asset in his world of smoke and mirrors. The war reached its peak on the 3rd day. His sister, Genevieve, reappeared. She didn't knock. She used a key and stormed into the house like a hurricane, her face a mask of panic and fury. "Julian, what in God's name are you doing?" she shrieked, finding us in the study. She barely registered my presence. "Elias just called me. He said your lawyers are threatening him with federal prison. This is insane. This vendetta against him will make our family a laughingstock. You have to stop this." Julian rose slowly from his chair, his face like stone. He let her rant, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finally ran out of breath, he spoke, his voice like ice. "He was sleeping with my wife, Jen," he stated calmly. "He was stealing millions of dollars from my company, from our family." He took a step closer to her. "And you knew." He didn't phrase it as a question. "Didn't you?" The accusation hung in the air, electric and deadly. Genevieve's face crumpled. The color drained away, leaving her looking pale and suddenly older. I didn't know the extent of it, I swear," she stammered. She told me she was unhappy that she and Elias were close." "You knew enough," Julian cut her off, his voice merciless. "You knew enough to lie to my face. You knew enough to let him into my house, to let him play with my daughter." He shook his head, a look of profound, weary disgust on his face. "You're my sister, my only family, and you chose to protect a snake instead of your own blood." He pointed to the door. "Get out of my house and don't come back." The confrontation was brutal, swift, and final. It left another gaping crack in Julian's already shattered world. He had just severed his last remaining family tie. He was truly, utterly alone, except for Lyra, and strangely, except for me. He watched his sister leave, and then his shoulders slumped. He sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. In the midst of all that corporate carnage, a strange, unspoken partnership had been forged. We were 2 soldiers in a trench, fighting a war he never even knew he was in. And in that moment, all I wanted to do was find a way to help him win. The war ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, decisive signature on a settlement document. Julian got the call from his lead attorney late one afternoon. I was in the living area with Lyra, and I saw him through the glass wall of his study as he took the call. He stood very still, listening, and then said a single, quiet, "Thank you," before hanging up. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look relieved. He just looked empty. The battle was over. Elias Vance would disappear from their lives, every stolen dollar would be returned, and the whole sordid affair would be buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements. Julian had won, but it was a hollow, desolate victory. He had successfully amputated the cancer from his life, but the phantom pain, I could tell, was just beginning. In the days that followed, a profound, exhausted quiet settled over the mansion. The black cars with tinted windows no longer crunched up the gravel driveway. The angry, urgent phone calls ceased. The house could breathe again. It was just us, Julian, Lyra, Mrs. Gable, and me. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the cold, sterile silence of before. It was the quiet after a hurricane has passed, leaving behind a landscape that is both devastated and strangely cleansed. Julian was different. The cold, laser-focused fury was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness that seemed to settle in his bones. He emerged from his study. He spent hours with Lyra, not just observing, but participating. He'd sit on the floor while she played, just holding her, his large hands stroking her back as if she were his only anchor in a world that had come untethered. Sometimes I would find him standing over her crib late at night, just watching her sleep, his face a canvas of profound regret and overwhelming love. He was mourning a woman he had never really known, and grappling with the devastating knowledge that his entire marriage, the very foundation of his adult life, had been a lie. And he started talking to me. Really talking, not about Lyra's schedule or household logistics, but about himself. One cool evening, he found me out on the patio, wrapped in one of the cashmere throws, looking up at the impossible number of stars visible in the clear mountain sky. He came out with 2 mugs, handing one to me. It was warm, fragrant tea. He sat in the chair next to mine, a comfortable distance between us, and for a long time we just watched the cosmos. I grew up in Baton Rouge, he said suddenly, his voice quiet, directed at the darkness. In a trailer park near the chemical plants. My father took off when I was 6. My mother worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses, actually just to keep us fed. I turned to look at him, stunned into silence by the confession. I promised myself when I was 10 years old that I would never ever be powerless again, he continued, his voice thick with the memory of it. That I would build a fortress so high no one could ever touch me, so strong no one could ever betray me. He looked around at the magnificent, sterile house surrounding us. I built this glass house, Sierra, because I thought if everything was transparent, if I could see everything coming, I couldn't be hurt. I was wrong. He gave a short, bitter laugh. The most dangerous lies are the ones you can't see, the ones that are living right beside you. His vulnerability was a raw, open thing, and it was an invitation. So I, in turn, told him about my life. I never knew my parents. I said, my voice barely a whisper. I was a ward of the state. I bounced between 4 different foster homes before I was 10. I told him about the feeling of living out of a single bag, of never putting posters on the wall because you knew you wouldn't be there long. I told him about the constant, gnawing feeling of being temporary, of never truly belonging anywhere. That's why Lyra's safety, her need for consistency, feels so personal to me. I finished, my throat tight, because I know what it feels like to be a child with no one in the world to count on. In that quiet, starlit space, sharing our scars, we stopped being the billionaire and the nanny. The power dynamic that had defined us dissolved into the night air. We became 2 people, Julian and Sierra, who had both been profoundly broken by life, and were now tentatively, cautiously trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together. A few days later, I found him in the nursery, looking utterly and completely defeated. A massive, flat-packed box for a ridiculously complicated wooden rocking horse lay open on the floor. Pieces of lacquered wood, bags of screws, and a multi-language instruction manual were scattered around him in a halo of chaos. He was trying to do something fatherly, something normal, and failing spectacularly. He ran a hand through his hair, a look of pure frustration on his face. I can orchestrate a multi-billion-dollar hostile takeover, he muttered, more to himself than to me. But I can't make sense of this. It wasn't about the rocking horse, not really. It was about his inability to assemble the simple, basic building blocks of a normal life. I smiled, a real, warm smile. I walked over, sat down on the floor beside him amidst the wreckage, and picked up the cryptic instruction manual. I found the diagram for step 1 and located the 2 corresponding pieces of wood. I handed one to him. Let's try it together, I said softly. He looked at me, his frustration melting away, replaced by a look of surprise and gratitude. He took the piece of wood, and we did. The next hour we worked in a comfortable, easy silence, our hands occasionally brushing as we reached for the same screw. Slowly, methodically, piece by piece, we built something new. It was just a toy, a silly, overpriced rocking horse, but it felt like more. It felt like hope. The rocking horse was a turning point. It was a small, silly thing, but it symbolized a new dynamic that had taken root between us. We were partners, not in business, not in any official capacity, but in the messy, complicated, and often frustrating project of building a life. The Julian I knew now was a world away from the cold, imperious man who had found me on the nursery floor. The grief hadn't vanished. I could still see it sometimes in the quiet moments, a shadow behind his eyes, but it was no longer his defining feature. He was softer, more present. He laughed more, especially at himself. He'd even started a new ritual. Every evening at 6:30, the 3 of us would have dinner together at the small table in the kitchen. No phones, no business talk. He'd tell Lyra about his day in simple terms and she would babble back, telling him about hers. We were just family. The word still felt foreign and fragile on my tongue, something that belonged to other people, but it was slowly, surely starting to feel real. But as our personal world began to heal and settle into this new, comfortable rhythm, a different kind of restlessness began to stir within me. I loved this life. I loved Lyra with a fierceness that scared me, and my feelings for Julian were deepening into something quiet, strong, and undeniable. And yet, I felt adrift. I would stand in my beautiful, enormous guest suite and feel like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. I was no longer just Lyra's nanny. I was Julian's confidante, his partner in crisis, his friend. The lines had become so blurred I didn't know where my role ended and myself began. I looked in the mirror one night and asked my reflection, "Who are you, Sierra Jones, when you're not in these walls?" The question echoed in the silence. I needed something for myself, something that was mine, built with my own two hands. And I started thinking about the other women like me. The women in the shadows, the caregivers, the housekeepers, the nanas. The ones who pour their hearts into raising children that aren't theirs, who clean houses they could never afford, who fall through the cracks of a system that sees them as disposable. The women who, like me, knew what it was like to sleep on the floor just to keep a baby warm. I rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times before I finally got the courage to approach him. I found him one evening by the fireplace, reading a book, a rare moment of peace. Lyra was asleep upstairs. "Julian," I began, my voice nervous but determined. "I need to talk to you about something." He put his book down, giving me his full attention. "Of course, what is it?" "I want to start a foundation," I said, the words rushing out now that I'd started. "A small one here in town, a place to provide temporary housing, legal aid, and job training for domestic workers, for women who are in crisis, who have nowhere else to turn. I want to call it the Hearthstone Project." I finished, my heart pounding, fully expecting him to pull out a checkbook, to offer to fund the entire thing, to take my fledgling idea and absorb it into his own vast portfolio of philanthropic ventures. Instead, he just listened, his expression serious and thoughtful. He was quiet for a long moment when I finished. Then he leaned forward, met my eyes, and asked the foremost beautiful words I had ever heard. "How can I help?" he asked. Not, "Let me do it for you," not, "Here's the money," but "How can I support you?" Tears sprang to my eyes. It was everything. It was the ultimate show of respect for my independence, for my vision. It was him seeing me separate from him, separate from Lyra, and wanting to champion that person. "Just believe in me," I whispered. "I already do," he said softly. I used the money I had so carefully saved, the doubled salary, the bonuses he'd insisted on, to lease a small, slightly rundown office space in a more modest part of Aspen, away from the glitz of the designer boutiques. The paint was peeling and one of the windows was drafty, but it was mine. I painted the walls myself, a warm, welcoming shade of sage green. I bought furniture from second-hand stores. The day the sign went up above the door, "The Hearthstone Project," I cried. The first few months were a struggle. I spent my days writing grant proposals, networking with local social workers, and meeting with women who needed help. My evenings were still with Lyra and Julian, a warm haven to return to after a long, often draining day. It was exhausting balancing these two worlds, but it was the most fulfilling work I had ever done. Julian's help was exactly what he'd promised, quiet, supportive, and in the background. He didn't throw money at me. Instead, he connected me with a pro bono lawyer from a top Denver firm who helped me navigate the complexities of setting up a 501c3. He had his company's IT department build me a simple, beautiful website for free. One evening when I was working late, covered in paint and drowning in paperwork, there was a knock on the office door. It was him, holding a thermos of hot coffee and a bag of sandwiches from my favorite deli. He just smiled, set them on my desk, and said, "Don't work too hard." He didn't try to control it. He was supporting my dream, not co-opting it. One crisp afternoon, the bell on my office door jingled. I looked up and was shocked to see Julian's sister, Genevieve, standing there. She looked different. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and the hard, brittle edge she always carried was gone, replaced by a tired sort of humility. "Sierra," she said, her voice quiet. "Can I come in?" I nodded, gesturing to one of the slightly wobbly chairs. "I was wrong," she began, sitting down and looking at her hands. "About everything. I was so caught up in protecting the family name, the image, I forgot to protect the actual family." She looked around my small, humble office. "What you're doing here, it's what my sister-in-law should have done. She had all the resources in the world, but she never had the heart for it." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the desk to me. "This is from her personal estate, the part that Julian managed to recover. He wanted you to have it, he said. He said you know what to do with it." I opened the envelope. Inside was a check written from a trust account for an amount that made my hands tremble. I looked at her, my eyes wide. Genevieve, I can't accept this. Yes, you can, she said, a faint, sad smile on her face. Please, think of it as building a better legacy for her name. I looked down at the check and then back at her. It wasn't a handout, it was an investment, it was an apology, it was a beginning. A year can feel like a lifetime, or in my case, it can feel like the first true year of a life I never thought I'd get to live. A year after Genevieve Croft walked into my humble office, everything had changed. The Hearthstone project was thriving. It was no longer just me and a few wobbly chairs. We had a small but dedicated team, including Maria, my very first client, who now worked as our part-time office manager, her quiet competence a daily reminder of why we were doing this. We had helped over a dozen women get back on their feet, providing them not just with a safe place to land, but with the resources and respect they needed to take flight again. The check from Genevieve's estate had allowed us to secure a larger, permanent space, a warm, bright haven with a small, attached playroom for children. I had found my purpose, my calling, etched not in the service of one family, but in the service of many. Julian had changed too. The transformation was profound, reaching into every corner of his life. About 6 months ago, he sold the glass mansion on the mountain. I couldn't hear Lyra laugh in that house. He told me one night, his voice serious. The sound just got lost in all that space. It was a monument to a life that wasn't real. He bought a beautiful, warm, sprawling house made of reclaimed wood and river stone, nestled in a grove of aspen trees. It was a house meant for laughter and living, with big, comfortable sofas, shelves overflowing with books and toys, and a huge open kitchen where Lyra's crayon drawings were held proudly on the refrigerator by an assortment of mismatched magnets. He had also restructured his company, promoting people from within, creating a culture that valued ethics as much as profit. He was still a brilliant, formidable businessman, but his ambition was now tempered with a deep and genuine humanity. In us, our relationship had evolved into a quiet, steady love. It wasn't a whirlwind, headline-grabbing romance. It was something built slowly, piece by piece, like the rocking horse we had assembled on the nursery floor. It was built on the solid bedrock of shared trauma, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding friendship. He never officially asked me to move in. There was no grand gesture. One day, I just realized that most of my clothes were already in the closet of the master bedroom. My favorite coffee mug was a permanent fixture by the sink, and the thought of going back to my small apartment felt like leaving home. It just happened. We became a family not by design but by choice. One crisp autumn evening, with the aspen leaves outside turning a fiery gold, we were all in the backyard. The air smelled of wood smoke and the rich scent of oncoming evening. I was pushing Lyra, now a chattering, happy toddler with her father's intense blue eyes, on a tire swing that hung from the thick branch of an old oak tree. Her delighted shrieks and giggles were the only music we needed. Across the lawn, Julian was standing at the outdoor grill, humming comically off-key, attempting to cook burgers without burning them. He was wearing an old, faded t-shirt and jeans, a smudge of ketchup already on his cheek. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the peaks in breathtaking shades of orange and pink. The sheer, simple, profound happiness of the scene, the laughing child, the loving man, the magnificent, peaceful view, brought a lump to my throat and tears to my eyes. Julian must have sensed my stillness. He turned from the grill, wiping his hands on a towel, and walked over to me. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, his body warm and solid against mine, and rested his chin on my shoulder as we both watched our daughter swing through the golden light. "What are you thinking about?" he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. My mind flashed back a lifetime away to that first night. To a cold, marble floor in a silent, sterile house. To a tiny, screaming baby who felt all the world's sorrow. I thought about the angry, broken man who had looked at me with such contempt, and how he had become this man, the one holding me now, his heart as open and vulnerable as my own. "I was just thinking," I said, my voice thick with emotion as I leaned back into his embrace, "that sometimes you have to sleep on the floor to learn what it feels like to finally stand on solid ground." He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his head and gently kissed the side of my head, his lips warm. "You're not just my solid ground, Sierra," he said, his voice husky, full of a love that still made my heart ache in the best possible way. "You're my home." And as I looked at the laughing child who was my heart, the loving man who was my anchor, and the breathtaking view that was our life, I knew he was right. I wasn't the nanny anymore. I wasn't a project or a secret. I wasn't a temporary solution to a problem. I was home. And it was a home built not of glass and steel and secrets, but of something far stronger, far more resilient, a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged beautifully and unexpectedly whole. Looking back on it all now, from the warmth of the home we built, a home now filled with Lyra's bright, endless chatter, it's funny how the biggest moments of your life, the ones that change everything, often start so quietly. They don't announce themselves with trumpets. Sometimes they start with the simple, desperate act of sleeping on the floor to comfort a crying child. My story with Julian began with labels, the nanny and the billionaire, the help and the master of the house. Our world is so quick to put us into these boxes, to define us by our jobs, our bank accounts, or the circumstances we were born into. But if I've learned anything, it's that those are just costumes we wear. The real story, the one that truly matters, is always about the person underneath. It's about character. It's about the choices we make when no one is watching. I've been asked if I believe people can truly change. I don't think people change, not really. I think they can be revealed. Julian wasn't a monster who became a good man. He was a broken, grieving man who had built a fortress of anger and ambition around his heart to protect it. My presence and Lyra's desperate need for connection didn't change him. It just finally gave him a reason to lower the drawbridge. He had to learn that vulnerability wasn't a weakness to be hidden, but the very foundation of strength. And I had to learn that my own past, the years I spent feeling invisible and temporary in the foster care system, wasn't a source of shame. It was the source of my greatest strength, my empathy. My ability to see pain in others was born from having intimately known it myself. The very thing I thought made me weak was what made me essential. That's the lesson, isn't it? That our scars don't have to be what defines us, but they can be what connects us. We spend so much of our lives searching for value in things that shine, only to find our greatest treasures in the quiet, steady warmth of a heart that sees us in the dark. So I ask you, what does home really mean to you? Is it a place with four walls, or is it the feeling of being truly seen by another person? Do you believe a person's worth is determined by their title, or by their capacity for kindness? Black Circle, if this story made you think about the quiet heroes and unseen acts of kindness in your own life, please share your thoughts in a comment below. I'd love to read them. Black Circle, if you have a different perspective on love, change, and what it means to build a family, please share it. The most beautiful conversations come from different points of view. Black Circle, and finally, if you love stories that explore the depths of the human heart, stories that remind us that we are all more than the labels the world gives us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey we take together.